Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Kudriavtseva, and thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we have the opportunity of speaking with Natalia Kudriavtseva. Natalia Kudriavtseva is a professor in the Department of Translation and Foreign Languages at Kherson University in Ukraine. She holds a PhD in social philosophy, and her habilitation thesis is in linguistics. In her research, she focuses on language policies, identities, and the Ukrainian language education, which is at the intersection of second language pedagogy, linguistic anthropology, and sociolinguistics. Her recent work explores how Ukrainian can be extended to the speakers of Russian and how common perceptions of the language affect the willingness to learn and use Ukrainian by Russian speakers in Ukraine. Natalia has published in the Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development and the Ideology and Politics journal. She also written for the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars, where she held her Fulbright fellowship in 2009. In 2017 and 2019, she contributed to the UK-based project Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals, Transforming Societies, where she focused on Ukrainian-Russian bilingualism in southeastern Ukraine. We'll start with a lecture, and Natalia today presents on 30 years of the Ukrainian language revival, challenges and prospects. Please submit your comments and your questions via our Q&A option. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion after the lecture. And you can also join our discussion directly if you use our function raise hand. At this point, I would like to welcome Natalia. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today and present my talk on the Ukrainian language revival in independent Ukraine. In this talk, I will look at the evolution of attitudes towards the Ukrainian language through the prism of language revitalization. The concept of language revival or revitalization is most often used in the context of endangered and minority languages facing the risk of extinction. Traditionally, those are languages without official statuses within nation states, with small and decreasing numbers of speakers and used in restricted sets of domains. The Ukrainian language has enjoyed a state language status since 1989, and according to the criteria set by the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, at present, it cannot be considered an endangered language. However, since the late 18th century, the development of Ukrainian had been restricted in the part of Ukraine under Austro-Hungary, and its use had been severely limited and even forbidden in the part under the Russian Empire. In these conditions, the Ukrainian language could hardly be standardized until the 1920s, the time known as Ukrainianization, promoted by the USSR. This brief period of renaissance brought about the first official orthography of the Ukrainian language in 1921, as well as the famous Kharkiv pravopis, seen as uniting the eastern and western variants of the Ukrainian standard and thus symbolizing the unity of the two parts of Ukraine. These first achievements however, quickly turned down in the 1930s by Stalin's campaign against Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism that targeted not only people, but also some elements of the Ukrainian language, allegedly identified as bearing a nationalist sense. In this slide, you can see examples of Russified linguistic forms imposed on Ukrainian standards during the 1930s. This policy, known as Russification, continued throughout the Soviet time. Its aim was a gradual convergence of Ukrainian and Russian in structure and overall marginalization of Ukrainian to a language of limited use. The development of Ukrainian under the USSR can hardly be evaluated in absolute terms. In Soviet times, Ukrainian could hardly function in local and state government, law enforcement, army, higher education, church, and urban everyday life. Portrayed as a backward provincial language, Ukrainian was opposed to the advanced language Russian, seen as a key to upward social mobility and success. Nevertheless, in the time after World War II, up until 1989, the Ukrainian language was sufficiently standardized. It was introduced as the medium of education in some schools and preschools, and was taught as a subject in schools with Russian as the major means of instruction. However, its functional limitation and the common perception of Ukrainian as a primitive, non-prestigious language that was cultivated under the Soviet regime caused a widespread shift to Russian, especially in Ukraine's southeast. Perceptions of languages under renewal are central to studying their revitalization processes of endangered and minoritized tongues. Within linguistic anthropology, which takes an ethnographically informed and critical approach to revitalization, these perceptions have been referred to as language ideologies, broadly defined as beliefs or feelings about languages as used in their social worlds. Significant in this respect is that such ideologies are not merely certain accustomed stereotypes about the nature and use of language, but they are always morally and politically loaded beliefs about language. These are the exact kind of perceptions of Ukrainian and Russian in Soviet times, which presented them as respectively an inferior and a superior language. Besides these perceptions, language ideologies also involve beliefs of how languages should be acquired and semiotic associations of certain language forms with specific speakers. That is, when a particular identity is linked to language. Clarification of these ideologies is key to the successful renewal of a revitalized language, since some of these beliefs can significantly impede efforts at revitalization. If a language is perceived as unprestigious, then a shift to a more prestigious language takes place. In order to tackle pejorative views from the outside, as in the case with Ukrainian, endangered languages are often perceived as national treasures. This ties language to local culture and a particular identity, and it entails a conception of there being some exemplary speakers, usually the native speakers, who are the only source of authority over the ways of how this language should be learned and used. In most cases of threatened languages, this belief takes the form of purism, and the purist ideologies are known to even strengthen in the fact of observable language loss. It is namely this view of language as identity that shaped the initial period of the formation of the Ukrainian standard. Yuri Shevelyov wrote that the concept of modern Ukrainian was rooted in the Romanticist ideology. In the 19th century, the Ukrainian language was conceived of as a living vernacular, used primarily in the village, and it was opposed to Russian as a bookish and city tongue. This was also the leading criteria for Ukrainian linguistic purism, exercised as mainly an anti-Russian purism by the language standardizers of the time. The purist stance emerged again after Ukraine gained independence, but if earlier those were some Ukrainian writers, such as Ivan Kotlяревский, Grigory Kvitko-Osnovyanenko, and Marko Vovchok, who were considered to be the exemplary speakers, because their language was closest to Ukrainian folk speech. In the 1990s, an intangible group of some authentic language speakers and servants called upon to preserve the ideal Ukrainian language assumed this role. The post-Soviet change in the source of authority over the Ukrainian standard brought a change in the criteria for linguistic purism, although primarily it meant to dissociate Ukrainian from the position of the inferior language and raise its status to a language of high prestige. The ideology underpinning this change bore some traits of Romanticism, as it was a distinctively one nation, one language conception. However, this conception abandoned the Romanticist idealization of nature as opposed to culture, and its association with a living vernacular of the peasantry, typical for the 19th century making of the Ukrainian standard. The new ideology thus sought to surmount the Soviet pejorative views of Ukrainian as a peasant, provincial language, and bring to life a connotation of the urban elite. Comprised of Ukrainian-speaking scientists, artists, and authors were the new exemplary speakers, setting criteria for the linguistic purism of the early post-Soviet years. The purist tendencies then even intensified, as is often the case in the time of social confusion, which was additionally stimulated by the discourse of language endangerment, which had wide currency in Ukraine at that time. The primary focus was on achieving an idealized standard, which affected the practices of language standardization directed towards the revision of previously established norms, while also guiding the state-sponsored project of Ukrainian language revitalization, realized primarily in Ukraine's public schools. In this respect, Ukraine was quite similar to Catalonia and Corsica, where two languages also compete, though these areas do not enjoy political independence. Research on Catalan and Corsican revitalization revealed that the identity framework in language renewal contexts has rather a damaging effect. It has been shown for the Catalan language, for instance, that identity value, once secure in the language survival under the conditions of subordination, now constrains its acquisition and use. On the contrary, what should be stressed is the value of language as a means of communication. And this is the discursive strategy harnessed by dominant languages, which are often portrayed as neutral communication. Under the language as identity framework, concerns for the purity and correctness exerted the same negative influence in Ukraine. And here is, here on this slide, I quote Lada Vilanyuk, who states the same, thus purism was working against language revival. Initially seeking to attribute to the Ukrainian language prestige and value as a symbol of distinctive identity, the purist ideologies have been effective in forming this attitude among Ukrainian people, though they have brought little change in the language practice itself. In her ethnographic research of Ukrainian language and literature classrooms, Deborah Friedman showed that in the formal schooling, the emphasis fell on socializing school children into an imagined community of the Ukrainian nation, rather than motivating them to develop communicative skills in Ukrainian, either as a second language or mother tongue. Traditional in these classrooms have been error correction routines accompanied by valorization of the pure and beautiful language and deprecation of hybrid practices and non-standard use. This entailed a socialization against very high standards, perceived to be accessible only to a small group of exemplary speakers, such as, for instance, the Ukrainian language teachers themselves. Similarly, Abel Police, in his study of schools in largely Russian-speaking Odessa, found that school policies centered on anchoring national identity, whereby the use of Ukrainian was limited to special occasions and could not penetrate into informal domains. As can be seen in my son's own textbook, the language as identity view and the concept of one of the most melodious languages are still articulated in Ukraine's schools. The ideology of the 1990s eased as Ukrainians gained more confidence in their state's independence and in the status of the Ukrainian language itself. They emerged a more positive attitude towards non-standard forms, as well as a descriptive approach to language, which balanced the prescriptivism of the early post-Soviet years. One evidence of this relaxation is the coming out of Lesya Stavitska's dictionaries of Ukrainian slang and obscene lexics, which marked a de-idealization of Ukrainian in the academia, as Lada Vilanyuk writes. The time of the Euromaidan has seen a reappreciation of non-standard language in social media. On the one hand, the events fueled an ever stronger upturn in the one nation, one language conception, while on the other, they provoked a rise of dysphonism, obscenities, and hyper-misspelled forms, as well as a revitalization of the Ukrainian-Russian mixed variety surjik. In this slide, you can see Roman Vintonyev performing journalist Michael Schur, a supposed descendant of Ukrainian immigrants to Canada, who speaks a pre-Soviet Western Ukrainian dialect in his news program Грати песик дужка гривня знак питання $0, and this is the title of his news program. Yes. And also the popular myths of the Ukrainian language, such as the most melodious language, the pure and beautiful language where no obscenities ever occur, and the surjik has nothing to do with the true Ukrainian language. These myths have been systematically shattered online. Check out, for instance, the recently launched YouTube channel Твоя підпільна гуманітарка. This relaxation of attitudes signals that the prestige of Ukrainian has heightened enough for it to conquer wider domains of communication. Of special importance are the colloquial domains, where humor and irony are often achieved by non-standard use, and which are often more attractive for younger generations of speakers. These developments in the perception of the Ukrainian language testify to a gradual disappearing of the views of language endangerment and the move away from the language as identity ideology toward a new ideological frame. Revitalization is now less focused on attempting to bring back the former patterns of use. Instead, it centers on bringing the language forward to new uses and uses. This future-oriented approach is set to overcome endangerment-related views while also placing special emphasis on language learners labeled as new speakers. That is, people with little or no home community exposure to a language which they learn secondarily through the study in informal programs or in schools. Another novelty is seeing revitalization not as a top-down regulation, but as a community-driven, bottom-up kind of movement, which anchors its success in the motivation of the future speakers and their support by the community of which they are a part. Such is the movement of the free Ukrainian language courses, безкоштовні курси української мови, which is a volunteer network of Ukrainian language instructors specifically targeting adult speakers of Russian in Ukraine. The courses were launched in 2012 as a public reaction towards the implementation of the notorious Kolesnichenko-Kivalov law, which had enabled the expansion of Russian at the regional level. As a grassroots initiative, the courses first presented an opportunity for adult speakers of Russian to immerse in a Ukrainian language environment. And later, in 2014, they provided a space where internally displaced people from Donbass could integrate into local communities and society as a whole. Since 2013, the courses have spread to more than 30 cities and towns, at one time uniting around 100 volunteer instructors all over Ukraine, and they still remain a single available opportunity to learn Ukrainian for free outside the school system. The COVID-19 pandemic suspended the face-to-face classes for some time, but they resumed again in the autumn of 2020 and still operate offline in Kherson, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Chernihiv, and some other places in Ukraine. During my field research in Kherson, which included ethnographic observations and interviews with the course's instructors and students, I encountered various people participating consciously or subconsciously in the Ukrainian language revitalization in the southeastern parts of Ukraine. Among these new Ukrainian speakers, there were people who migrated to Ukraine from former Soviet republics long time ago and hadn't learned Ukrainian at school altogether, local people who had a disappointing experience of learning Ukrainian at school, internally displaced people from Crimea and Donbass, recent migrants from Russia who came to Ukraine after the Euromaidan. There also were local people who recently switched from Russian to Ukrainian in their daily lives. They sought for a Ukrainian-speaking environment and were anxious to invest in the language learning, as their main motivation was contributing to nation building and the independence of the Ukrainian state. Later, others came with pragmatic motivations. They needed the language for work. The purpose obviously brought about by the 2019 law on language that, among other things, mandates Ukrainian to be the main language of education and the default language of public service all over Ukraine. During my ethnographic research into the language ideological background of the course's instruction, I was struck by the change in the understanding of the Ukrainian language, as well as in the language pedagogy implied in the teaching approach. The major shift I observed was from postulating Ukrainian as a language for identification, the Rідна мова for Ukrainians, to promoting the view of Ukrainian as a communication tool. This was explicitly stated in the introductory class that emphasized acquiring fluency in Ukrainian as a new opportunity with a motivation oriented towards the future rather than the past. In our interviews, the course's initiator and Ukrainian language activist Anastasia Rozlutska, as well as the course's instructors, highlighted this view. On this slide, you can see excerpts from our interviews. I will not read them out to spare us some time for questions. The shift of the ideological focus from identity to communication grants the change in the language pedagogy the course's instructors employ. They teach Ukrainian to Russian speakers not as a native, but as a second or even foreign language. Teaching Ukrainian as a native language to students who do not speak Ukrainian at home has already been recognized inappropriate, and this is mentioned in the study by Lada Belonyuk and Svetlana Melnik. Instead, Ukrainian should be taught as a second language, whereby first language can also be used. Vera, an instructor from Kyiv, admits that in our interview. Under this framework, students' first language, Russian, is not seen as an obstacle in the acquisition process, but as an additional instrument you can use as an intermediary language to teach Ukrainian, says Alexandra, a courses instructor from Kyiv. One of the common routines I observed in Kherson Ukrainian language classes is drawing comparisons with Russian when discussing Ukrainian vocabulary and grammar. These frequent comparisons entail that hybrid Ukrainian-Russian practices are often the case. Though the courses instructors are reluctant to use Russian in class, they allow Russian translations and accept their students prompting Russian equivalents of some grammar terms or helping each other by briefly retelling some grammar material in Russian. This strategy is meant to persuade the students that they do not start from scratch, but are already equipped with some language knowledge. And Lilia, the courses instructor from Kherson, explains that to her students. The free Ukrainian language courses set the goal of enticing adult speakers of Russian into learning Ukrainian. And here, these hybrid linguistic practices has a useful effect. They serve to engage the students, encourage them to proceed with the course, and finally try to switch to Ukrainian no matter how much code switching and language mixing may occur in their way. Another important advantage is that this approach does not require them to reject their Russian-speaking identities, since not many learners are prepared to do that at the very start. The hybrid use also functions as an inclusion strategy, which recognizes even minimal proficiency in Ukrainian and endorses the students as legitimate speakers of both Ukrainian and Russian. The focus on communicative use entails a shift in the general appreciation of the Ukrainian language. Rather than drawing on the discourses of pure and melodious language, the courses instructors stress the necessity for a new ideological frame, which would allow Ukrainian extend to new social domains. The purpose is to go beyond the traditional views of Ukrainian as the language reserved for special occasions, and the language without mistakes and mixing, portrayed as a homogeneous entity. The ideological shift from the conception of pure and beautiful language to the view of living language, which changes and has a right to change, is in keeping with the earlier de-idealization of Ukrainian in the academia described by Lada Belnyuk, and marks a similar de-idealization of Ukrainian language teaching. Such an approach not only counters purist attitudes, but also suggests acceptance of non-standard varieties and language variation, which is crucial for extending the use of the language to new groups and domains. Neither of the world's nations speaks the literary variant of their language, says Lilia, in order to help the students get rid of the fear to sort of damage Ukrainian with their mistakes. Even the natives of Western Ukraine don't speak pure Ukrainian language, she adds. The course's initiator Anastasia Rozlutska puts forward extending Ukrainian to new domains as a mission of their volunteer project. This mission is envisioned as creating a Ukrainian language cultural space. By countering purist attitudes toward Ukrainian, the free Ukrainian language courses instructors aim to deconstruct the notion of an ideal Ukrainian speaker, which makes perceived Ukrainian language proficiency much more attainable than suggested by the purist stance. This also allows to extend the language to broader groups and domains as an effective means of communication. As we see, the development of the ideologies for the Ukrainian language exhibits a change in the dominant trend as Ukraine evolves through its independence. The language's identity view helped Ukrainians survive under the conditions of subordination in the Russian Empire and during the Soviet time. In the early post-Soviet years, concerns for the purity and correctness, together with the concept of beauty in language, worked to heighten the status of the language while forcing out the connotation of a backward, illegitimate tongue. Since the Euromaidan, the status of Ukrainian has been elevated, and it is not generally perceived to be second-rate anymore. Though purist ideologies still persist, the time since then witnessed a relaxation of language attitudes in the academia, social media, and Ukrainian popular culture. A similar shift has taken place in the informal teaching of the Ukrainian language. This new rhetoric does not draw on the endangerment-related views of Ukrainian, suggesting a future-oriented perspective instead. The evolution of attitudes towards the Ukrainian language can also be said to mirror a change in the public perception of Ukraine's independence, which has shifted from a mere aspiration to something already perceived as a fact. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Natalia. We're ready to proceed to our comments and questions. And we've got one question in our Q&A box, and let me read it out to you. What were, in your opinion, the main Soviet mechanisms of language and cultural oppression? Are there any of these still preserved in Ukrainian-Russian opposition of nowadays Ukraine?
The main mechanisms, I think I have already mentioned them, because it was, on the one hand, it was a systematic work on the changes over the structure of Ukrainian language, on making it similar, more similar to the structure of Russian, with the aim of portraying Ukrainian as not a separate independent language, but as a merely a dialect of Russian. On the other hand, it was a systematic work on the other front, which included this minimization of the role, marginalization of the role of Ukrainian, in order to portray it as a backward provincial language. And it was systematically spread, I think, during multiple ways of transmitting this idea. I mean, first of all, it was one of the avenues, I think, was translation, through translation, because as you know, translations were edited, and in many cases, these translations were made not from the original language, but from Russian. And there was a special committee who checked how close the Ukrainian translation is to the Russian one, and in terms of the language. Perhaps there was even a whole community of academics working on making the language similar, Ukrainian language similar, and on justifying the new terminology, because as you have seen in my slide, those were namely terms which were made similar to the Russian ones. Dictionaries, orthographies, and textbooks, the Ukrainian language grammar were published, suggesting gradually these different changes to the structure of Ukrainian language. So I think these were obvious, and we still experience these effect and these results in the old dictionaries. You can easily find them. I don't think that we still experience the censorship in our translations. And finally, there is freedom on how to use the Ukrainian language in them. But we can still see them in the old dictionaries and textbooks, as I said. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, sorry. So our next question, thank you very much for the presentation. Would you talk a bit more about the volunteer instructors? What are their background? Who are eligible to be considered as language instructors? Did they receive any teacher training before teaching the language?
Yes, thank you for your question. The volunteer initiative started as a grassroots project, and it was inspired and initiated by Anastasia Rozlutskaya, as I said, and the formerly member of parliament at the time, Oles Doni. But this initiative was purely grassroots. I mean that they didn't have and still don't have any funding from the government or from any other initiatives. They apply for funding from, for example, Ukrainian Cultural Fund or from some foreign organizations, but they receive this funding for specific projects, such as their online course, Ukrainian 27 lessons, and some other concrete initiatives. But on the ground, I mean, in terms of the classes, which I observed myself in this field research, no one helps and no one gives them any finance. In terms of training, yes, all the instructors in these courses are professional Ukrainian language teachers, and this is the necessary condition for them to be included in this initiative and for them to be able to hold this class, to conduct these classes. Before the pandemic, they had regular conferences in September or maybe in the summer, when they gathered together and tried to teach the instructors, I mean the leading instructors from Kyiv, and there was a picture in one of my slides of these 4 girls. They tried to teach the instructors from other cities how to learn Ukrainian in the communicative approach, how to move away from these old ideologies and not try to present the language in the old-fashioned way. Because when I spoke to them, they mentioned what I felt should have been done for the Ukrainian language long ago, and for the teaching of the Ukrainian language at schools. They mentioned the need to break away with this old vision of the Ukrainian language and to go to the communicative approach. So in terms of organization, this, on the one hand, this initiative is very much really volunteer initiative, but a self-organizing initiative. But on the other side, they are very professional and they are very, very well organized, because all of the people are really enthusiastic about that. And for example, Lila, who has been teaching Ukrainian as a part of the free Ukrainian language courses for 8 years now, she's so persistent and she's so set on going on with this course. And we already see the results, because more and more people come to the courses every year. and stay with them. For example, they finish one iteration of the course and they come the next year, and they they join the Ukrainian speaking club Devoslova, which is her other initiative, which does not so much teach the language, but just gives an opportunity to practice the language with the other speakers.
We've got a comment from Hiroaki.
I can talk for hours about it.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I agree that purists may damage the language revival. Easterners are criticized for their Russified Ukrainian, but I tell them that it's unfair. Tell the Galicians that they speak Polonized Ukrainian. The French and German purists complain about the Anglicization of their languages. Surjik should not be encouraged, but I think that any effort to use Ukrainian, however incomplete, should be accepted by the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people as a whole.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Well, nobody speaks the pure Ukrainian language. Nobody speaks the standard, that's true. And for example, I've been teaching English, and I keep telling my students that nobody speaks the pure English, nobody speaks the standard, just there are 3% of population who speaks. Those are people working on TV, news programs, and only they make no mistakes. Yes, it's a good point. But I think a very important way of developing this idea is to try to introduce this new approach and this new ideological vision to the Ukrainian schools, to the formal schooling. Because as I showed you in my son's own textbook from his first grade, this idea of the pure and one of the most melodious languages in the world still persists. And the language there, as I see, he's already in the third grade, as I see this idea keeps being reiterated. And this vision of the language reserved for special occasion, you cannot speak this language if you think that you do not speak it purely. This idea is still present there. And the whole vision of this language, you know, all these references to the 19th century, what they give in their textbooks, they do not really help, I think. But I don't really, if you ask me how to do that and how to influence the Ukrainian government, I don't really know. But I think that this is a very good way. The initiative, the Free Ukrainian Language Courses, does a great job in popularizing these ideas and popularizing the new way of perceiving the Ukrainian language. As the girls say, we do not try to canonize the language. Yes, we do not that it is something so specific, so ideal, or so beautiful. It is just a language like any other. So, and with the work that I know they have been doing all this time, and with the many more online courses that they have been producing, I think there is a good chance of going on with this idea and perhaps attracting more people in the government, maybe in some official authorities, such as the State Committee for the Ukrainian Language Standards and the authorities of such kind, to attract the attention to this new way, to this new vision, and finally bring it to the school textbooks. Thank you.
We have a question from Alex Bogisish. Apologies if I mispronounced the name. I know actress Mila Kunis was born in Ukraine and speaks fluent Russian. Were Jewish Ukrainians like Mila Kunis and other minorities more likely to speak Russian than Ukrainian during that era? I guess the 80s I meant here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't really research into this direction, into this question, but from what can I tell you, knowing Odessa and visiting Odessa for many times, it is famous. This is famous for its Jewish population, the specific sort of social that they speak. Yes, they mostly speak Russian. And one of the problems with the Free Ukrainian Language course is that there was an attempt to start a Ukrainian class in Odessa, but it wasn't successful. So Odessa still is very much Russian language, a Russian-speaking town. So I asked specifically because I know that there were courses in Mykolaiv and there were courses in all of the eastern parts. Before the war, there were courses in Donetsk, in Luhansk, and with the beginning of the war, they moved on the Ukraine-controlled territory, and they were functioning in Drushkivka, in Shastya. So if you look at the map, you will see that these places, these towns, are all situated along the front line, and they still function in Kramatorsk, which is not so easy, as I've been told, which is not so quite easy for them to function there, because no one accepts this idea of the Ukrainian language being told there in Kramatorsk. So I can't really tell you about the Jewish population at the time, but I think it was mainly Russian.
So this is a question from Victoria Malko. Thank you very much for your talk. What specific difficulties Russian speakers have while learning Ukrainian? If it's so hard to learn Ukrainian, why does the myth persist that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, quote unquote, with common language?
Do you think that this myth still persists?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it persists somewhere else. I don't know. I haven't heard about this myth in Ukraine. I mean, I heard about this myth, but there were continuous attempts in academic articles that I read to show that it really is a myth. Such as, for example, the article written by academic Viktorak from the Institute of Linguistics, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. There was a brilliant article written in the 90s, telling that this is a myth. In terms of the difficulties that Russian speakers experience while learning Ukrainian, these are difficulties of all sorts of difficulties you may encounter while learning a foreign language. Of course, it is easier for them to learn Ukrainian than to learn English, for example, because they have a wider exposure to Ukrainian than to English in their daily lives. They may, for example, watch Ukrainian language TV, they may hear more of Ukrainian on the radio or somewhere else. Well, Kherson is a very much Russian-speaking city, but they still recently have been more people speaking Ukrainian in the streets. You can hear them there. But these difficulties, they start with phonology. I mean, with the pronunciation of some sounds, it's still very difficult for Russian speakers to understand the difference between Ukrainian g and h sounds. And this is the difficulty for Russians. For example, as I observed in these classes, there was one lady from Russia who recently migrated from Russia with her husband, Ukrainian husband, and she couldn't pronounce the Ukrainian h sound. She kept pronouncing it as g, and as a very voiced consonant, not voiceless. And it was one of the reasons, her pronunciation, that made her very shy and very reluctant to speak Ukrainian in class. And she then quit. I don't know why she quit. There may be difficulties with vocabulary. I think one of the main difficulty, because there is always this temptation of Ukrainianize a Russian word, to use a Russian word in a Ukrainian manner, which would be called a Russianism, yes, a Russianism. And the course is that language pedagogy in the course is built in this comparative approach, which helps people to see the difference. As Lilia says, I show them the difference for them to clearly know which is Russian, which is Ukrainian, and how they differ. Sometimes she shows the similarities, which makes it, again, easier to acquire Ukrainian. Sometimes she shows the differences when it is really, really important.
That was an interesting case on the pronunciation of g and g. I think that we're quite sympathetic toward other foreigners who try to speak Ukrainian, but maybe we should also be a little bit more sympathetic to the Russians who try to speak Ukrainian, because apparently there is some difficulty here in pronunciation.
Yes, we definitely should, because I remember that lady, and she really invested in this learning. She really wanted to acquire this pronunciation, but she just couldn't. It was, and she even recognized it in one of the classes, that I try to pronounce it the way you say, but I just can't. So it's, for them, it's really a foreign language. And for those who migrated from other republics, as I said, from Turkmenistan, for example, from Russia, a long time ago, they still didn't learn Ukrainian, because they told me it wasn't necessary for us. There was no need until 2019, the 2019 law on language.
Yes, and there is a follow-up comment from Hiraki Kuramiya regarding g and h. As you know, many people in southern Russia pronounce g as h. Many people I met in the Donbass speak the same. I don't think that it's an important problem for Russophones. To add to that, as far as I remember, this sound g was reintroduced into the Ukrainian alphabet sometime in the 90s. Yeah. And for us, it was quite odd to pronounce gudzik after we were pronouncing gudziki for decades.
Exactly, yes. But I think in terms of Russians, yes, coming from Russia, I think it really depends on the territory they come from. Because in some Russian dialects, yes, they have this pronunciation of h, yes, like in Ukrainian. But in some dialects, they do not have that, they do not understand that, they cannot imagine at the very start that this way of pronouncing can exist. So obviously this lady, I haven't talked to her, I haven't interviewed her. Obviously, this lady came from one of these regions with these kind of dialects spoken there.
Just one more comment about this g and h. Unfortunately, very often it becomes some place for jokes for Russian speakers, particularly from the central parts of Russia, and they often make comments like Ukrainians speak Russian in a very funny way. They say h, but not the g. But again, well, that's probably a different another area to talk about and to investigate further. We have a comment from Sophia Asher. Thank you for an informative talk. Can you please speak about the issues with politically correct preferred terms in Ukrainian and the overuse or underuse of feminitives? Thank you.
Politically correct and preferred terms. Well, I will not give you the exact examples, but I will try to explain the major trend, yes, about political correctness or preference. The farther you go from Russian, the better it is. So if you have, for example, a word in Ukrainian, which is actually Ukrainian word, but which is similar in pronunciation to a Russian word, you'd better not use it. If you have a synonymic word in Ukrainian, which is different from Russian. So now the tendency, as it has always been, is this anti-Russian purism. So if you have two words and one of them is similar to Russian, do not use it. Give your preference to the Ukrainian sound word. And the second part of the question was feminitives. Yes, it has been the recent trend, yes, and there have appeared a lot of different kinds of feminitives recently, and there's even been a debate on introducing them into the official classificator of professions, something like that. I'm not sure whether I'm correct, I'm translating correctly, but to introduce them into the official discourse. For example, if you receive a diploma of professor, it will not say attestat professora, but it will say attestat professor K. It's not yet settled, but the debate has been going on. And as I see, for example, I haven't researched into this topic yet, but what I can see, what I've noticed in public discourse or on some social media, more and more people are attracted by this tendency, and they use more and more feminitives. And there have been a conference, I know, on these feminitives, saying that this is a very, very old tradition in the Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian language has had these feminine forms for a very long time. This is not something new or introduced from some other languages. And I think another thing which makes feminitives so important is that it it is a feature which makes Ukrainian different from Russian. Because the trend that Ukrainian should be different, as it was in the 19th century, when it was mainly an anti-Russian plus an anti-Polish purism, this trend of making Ukrainian different from Russian as much as possible still persists and is still very powerful.
We have a couple more comments, and let me just organize them so that we get to the ones that we already discussed to some point, and then there is a lengthier one from Victoria Malko as well. So I'll start with another comment from Hiraki Kuramiya in terms of our previous discussion about g and h and h. The problem is that pronouncing g as h is regarded as uncultured in Russia. I was astonished to hear that sort of comment in Moscow. I corrected Muscovites that g is h in Ukrainian, not a matter of culturedness. Yeah, which is very true.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from Yulia Sherbak. Thank you so much for your presentation. What do you think about the law on provision of the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language? In your opinion, does it bring Ukrainian people together or separate the West and the East of Ukraine?
Does it bring the people together? Well, the law can be interpreted in this terms. You see, the point here is, I've seen one of the comments on the fact whether Ukrainian is one of the most melodious languages. Yes, saying that it is really one of the most melodious, but I'm not, you should understand me right here. I'm not trying to dispute about whether it is one of the most melodious languages or whether the law unites the people or on the contrary, yes, separates them. It is about how you perceive those facts. Whether you perceive Ukrainian as the most melodious, whether you believe it, yes, the whole concept of language ideologies is about what you believe, is about what you take uncritically. What teachers tell you at school and you take it in uncritically and you do not check. You don't really need any proofs for that. So the law can be interpreted as both uniting the people, the Ukrainian people, and separating them. It depends on the angle of your interpretation. But the main point of the law is to tell you how the language should function, is to tell you where it should be the default language, is to tell you that if a foreign company wants to sell something to Ukraine and it launches a website, then its default page should be in the Ukrainian language, not in English, not in Russian. And if it is higher education or secondary education in Ukraine, in public schools, yes, it should be in Ukrainian. The law is very controversial. And I have a little blog post with Kennan Institute about the law. But again, it's all of this can be, I think, estimated in terms of interpretation only. The language ideology, which is the basis, yes, and I analyzed the law in terms of language ideologies, and the language ideology, which is the basis of the law, is the language as identity, which basically tells you that to be considered a true Ukrainian, you should speak Ukrainian. But the law doesn't really tell you that to be considered a true Ukrainian, you should speak pure Ukrainian without any mistakes and mixing. In one of the drafts, in one of the previous versions of the law, there was something about damaging Ukrainian and I don't know, somehow punishing people if they damage Ukrainian, if they make mistakes in some official documents. But this was so controversial that this was then this was then eliminated from the law, and it's not, this article is not present in the final version, which was passed by the parliament. So again, it's all about the interpretation.
So, well, following up on this idea about the Ukrainian language as a melodious language, a comment from Victoria Malko, to add to the discussion of Ukrainian as the melodious language, it's not a myth from the point of view of voice pedagogy. Ukrainian is the second most beautiful language after Italian in the structure of its open syllabus, thus easy to sing on a vowel. And then she provides some more references, and she also refers to Oleg Trubachev and his work, An Etymological Dictionary of Russian. And then I'll skip one part of this comment and I'll get to this point where she talks about Russian and Ukrainian. As to the common East Slavic words, there are only 72 listed in this dictionary. Thus, Ukrainian and Russian languages share 0.6% of their vocabulary. See Ilko Medachevsky, Linguistic Insights into Ukrainian History. Professor Konstantin Tishchenko speaks about the role of modern linguistics in our identity and the rebuttal of the cradle of the three brotherly peoples theory, Ukrainian Weeks, November 16th to 2012. Ukrainian vocabulary was shaped mostly by European influences, especially by Latin and German, both directly and via Polish, whereas Russian borrowed a sizable part of its vocabulary from Turkic languages.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of similarities between Ukrainian and Russian, I'm familiar with Professor Tishchenko research, where he states, with his textbook, where he states that there is 38% of vocabulary which is different. So Ukrainian and Russian differ by 38% in terms of vocabulary. And this number is even bigger than the difference, for example, Spanish and Catalan. Spanish and Catalan are also related languages. And in terms of Ukrainian and Russian, in terms of the difference in their vocabulary. So yes, these are different languages. I did quite understand what you wanted to comment on, but I agree with you.
And a question from Olena Mazur. Are you familiar with the initiative Навчай українською, teach in Ukrainian, aimed to implement the language into different spheres like sports? They train coaches to speak Ukrainian, for example. My idea is the courses you've mentioned may not be the only way to study Ukrainian for free, just for our information, and thanks for the interesting review. I appreciate it a lot. But this is a very interesting question about, for example, the usage of the Ukrainian language in spheres. I would put it of power. For example, in the 90s, it was a real struggle for the policemen, for example, to use Ukrainian for their daily duty purposes. And even today, the language of power is associated, unfortunately, with the Russian language in the first place. It's the language of power in those institutions.
Yes, yes. It very much depends on the domains and on the domains, as I said. Yes, and the point of revitalization is to extend the language to newer domains. And in terms of teaching in Ukrainian, I'm very well familiar with this initiative, and I myself interviewed one of the initiators of this initiative for another Kennan blog post. And this initiative does not really teach Ukrainian. This initiative has several projects like marathons of 10, for example, 20 classes. And its main aim, another volunteer initiative, by the way, is to bring Ukrainian-speaking coaches, Ukrainian-speaking instructors in music, for example, or in some other spheres, in contact with Russian-speaking instructors, to help them contact each other, to help them find each other, and for these other people, for these coaches who speak Ukrainian, to show the Russian-speaking coaches and to help them how to switch to Ukrainian in their instruction. But they do not really teach Ukrainian to people. They may give them a start, but those are not, unfortunately, those are not systematic courses. I was talking about a systematic initiative which presents certificates and which has their own program, because they have their own program, they design their own materials themselves, and they have their own approach to teaching Ukrainian, which is this communicatively oriented approach.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. I think that was our last comment. We have a very vibrant discussion today, and I really appreciate your talk today. I believe that Ukraine entered this independent stage in the 90s with a very heavy burden from the past. in addition to all kinds of social and economic and political issues, we also have this cultural issue and linguistic issue as well. And yes, Ukraine received the Ukrainian language with this reputation of being a very melodious language, but also as a language of the village and as a backward language, I'm sorry to say that. And I think that this stereotype really persisted through the 90s, in spite of the fact that I believe it was Yushchenko who was the first president of Ukraine who used the help of interpreters when communicating with his Russian counterparts,
yes,
right?
Yes, right.
And it was Yushchenko. It was during the Yushchenko years when it was a real piece of news, and I think it stirred some negative emotions in Russia, because again, we approach the Ukrainian language when we speak about Russia from this perspective. Well, you understand me. You don't need an interpreter. You understand me. And there is this colonizer's attitude still. And unfortunately, I don't see any profound changes in Russia today in terms of changing their perspective on Ukraine and on the Ukrainian language specifically. Well, and I really appreciate your talk. Thank you so much for this information that you shared with us today. And I really believe that it's a significant and important contribution to changing how we think about not only Ukrainian language, but language in general. Language is some tool for communication. Of course, it is used for all kinds of political purposes and for all kinds of other purposes, manipulative purposes. But in the first place, it's a tool for communication, for delivering ourselves to the world and to sharing ourselves with the world, but not for some other purposes and for other stereotypical attitudes. Thank you so much, Natalia.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that this is not to minimize somehow the function of language as a marker of identity. Yes, I just wanted to emphasize that the approach which is effective in teaching the language is the communicative approach, is portraying the language as a means of communication. In teaching, this is effective in teaching of the language as a second or foreign language. This is the whole point about the courses. Yes, that you do not perceive these people to speak Ukrainian as a native language. Perceive them as if you were teaching English to them. Yes, you do not expect them to identify with the British nation or with the American nation. Well, thank you for having me for this discussion and for all the interesting questions.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for joining us today for our conversation with Natalia Kudriavtseva, who presented on 30 years of the Ukrainian language revival, challenges and prospects. And thank you so much for this vibrant discussion that we had today. For our future events, please visit our page on Facebook, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. Thank you so much.